For a Workers' Chamber, Part 5. Rocco believed that the emergence of organised mass industry had made economic liberalism, the law of supply and demand, and the democratic doctrine of one man, one vote all obsolete. The existence of syndicates did not produce the economic chaos and disorder now affecting capitalism. Rather, it was the result of the doctrines of political liberalism, which insisted that the state should be neutral and disarmed. He therefore demanded that the state should take over the syndicates and turn them into its organs. These bodies would then be strictly controlled and made universal and compulsory. The state would lay down strict rules for them. Strikes and lockouts will be banned and industrial disputes settled instead by courts or special magistrates. It was Rocco's conception of the function of the syndicates that formed the basis for the fascist corporate state. The syndicalists had moved towards fascism from a mixture of disillusionment with the working class and nationalist support for the First World War. They were frustrated with the working class's concentration on their immediate material interests at the expense of a revolutionary reconstruction of society. Support for Italian involvement in the First World War amongst the syndicalists was almost total. They believed that socialism needed to be national in its intent. They finally broke with it when they concluded that the real purpose of revolution should not be to replace capitalism, but the liberal political order, and decided that economic function would supply the basis for the new post-liberal social and political order. The syndicalists Lanzillo, Olivetti and Panunzio turned from the internationalist perspective of contemporary socialism to a doctrine of national syndicalism which would not just involve the workers, but all the productive classes, including managers and proprietors. These ideas gained a new following among young veterans who had been alienated by the war and were looking for some form of political renewal. The experience of the army's military hierarchy also influenced the attitudes towards the cooperative reorganization of society by young, middle-class army officers during the First World War. They found in it the pattern of the technocratic and managerial society which would protect their status afterwards. General dissatisfaction with post-war liberalism also led many others to turn to their economic, social and professional groups as an alternative to the traditional political organizations of parliamentary democracy. The Charter of Carnaro was drawn up following D'Annunzio's seizure of the Dalmatian island of Fiume from Yugoslavia in 1919, aided by demobilized Aiditi, the daredevils of the Italian army during the war, and the Syndicalist Seamen's Union. The island contained a large Italian population, and Italians expected that it would be given to them as part of the territorial reassignments afterwards. They were disappointed and outraged when it was given instead to Yugoslavia. This prompted D'Annunzio to raise his army to attack and conquer the island. The new social order envisaged by D'Ambris and D'Annunzio was to be cooperative in nature. The syndicalists rejected the notion of the citizen as an abstraction. The true social reality was the producer. Article 3 of the Constitution therefore declared that Fiume was a state chosen by the people, which has for basis the power of productive labour. Article 18 also stipulated that every adult citizen had to be a member of one of 10 official corporations. Whatever be the kind of work a man does, whether of hand or brain, art or industry, design or execution, he must be a member of one of the 10 corporations who receive from the commune a general direction as to the scope of their activities, but are free to develop them in their own way and to decide among themselves as to their mutual duties and responsibilities. These corporations were as follows. The first was for workers, small artisans and small farmers, who employed little labour and then only infrequently. The second was for technical and managerial staff in private business, with the exception of the proprietors of business partners. The third was composed of everyone in commercial enterprises, with the exception of the manual workers. The fourth was for all employers in industry, agriculture and commerce. However, they were to be not just proprietors, but also prudent and sagacious masters of industry. The fifth was for civil servants. The sixth was for the new state's intellectuals, the students, public school teachers, college and polytechnic students, and the artists, sculptors, painters, decorators, architects, and musicians. The seventh was for the members of the liberal professions not included in the previous corporations. The 8th was for the cooperative societies which were to be represented by their self-chosen administrators. The 9th was for every working on or in the sea. In addition to these, there was also a 10th corporation which had no special trade or register or title. It is reserved for the mysterious forces of progress and adventure. It is a sort of votive offering to the genius of the unknown, to the man of the future, to the hope for idealization of daily work, to the liberation of the spirit of man beyond the panting effort and bloody sweat of today. It was only from about 1925 onwards, after Mussolini had successfully consolidated his power, particularly in the suppression of the socialist trade unions, that he began to dispense with the liberal constitutional forms of the Italian state. The system of fascist corporations, which were to form the basis of the fascist corporative state, had been created as early as 1922 by Michele Bianchi in the Confederazione della Corporazioni Sindacali.
Hello. Well, it would be nice, but I'm going to...
Formed as part of the Fascist Party. These were industrial organisations which contained both representatives of the employers and the workers. Mussolini convinced Bianchi and Rossoni, the leader of the fascist trade unions, that the unions should be absorbed by the corporations, membership in which should be made compulsory. The corporations were also to be subject to state control. In January 1925, Mussolini appointed a commission for constitutional reform. Its majority report was written by Gino Arias, a medieval historian and economist. Arias recommended the establishment of a system of autonomous corporations, whose leaders would be elected on the basis of their membership in the industries and professions they represented. In industry, the workers, employers, and the managerial and technical staff would each elect 1/3 of these corporations' governing representatives. This would, Arias claimed, revive the glorious spirit of the old Italian communal organisation. The fascists rejected his recommendations because it was too democratic and did not permit the control of the corporations by the fascist state. Arias had rejected the fascist insistence that only one union should be officially recognised as an artificial and anti-economic system of coercion. He wished to retain the traditional system of collective bargaining and an active, independent role for the trade unions. The fascists, on the other hand, wished to see industrial disputes compulsorily settled by the state. The fascist Grand Council therefore threw out his report. On 3rd April 1926, Parliament passed the Leggi Sindacali, syndical law, drawn up by Alfredo Rocco, the Nationalist Minister for Justice. This law for the judicial regulation of labour disputes permitted only a single recognised organisation for workers and employers to exist for each industry. All industrial disputes were to be compulsory settled in a system of labour courts under a magistracy of labour. 2 months later, on 2nd July, Mussolini announced the formation of a new Ministry of Corporations, which would supervise them. This would initially set wages and conditions, but would eventually go beyond this to managing the economy. That same year, Rocco and the fascist official, Giuseppe Bottai, began work on the Carta del Lavoro. Pardon me. On the Carta del Lavoro, or Charter of Labour, which was eventually presented to the Fascist Grand Council in January the following year, and was promulgated on 21st July 1927. The Charter declared that work in all its forms is a social duty. The voluntary withdrawal of labour was made illegal. Private enterprise is praised as the most efficient method of production and the most advantageous to the state. The state, therefore, bound itself only to intervene when private industry fails or is insufficient, or when the political interests of the state are involved. Despite this, employers were required to hire their employees from those allocated to them by the fascist labour exchanges. They were also obliged to give preferential treatment to fascists, particularly long-standing members of the party. The Magistratura del Lavoro was established as a court of appeal for industrial disputes. The Charter also gave official ratification to the existing system of workers' rights, such as exemption from labour on Sundays, annual paid holiday, old age pensions, maternity pay, extra pay for night work, and sickness compensation and insurance supported by contributions from both employers and employees. This last, however, was coordinated by the state. In March 1913, Mussolini set up a National Council of Corporations as the corporation's governing assembly, composed of a General Assembly and a Central Council. The number of corporations included were 13. These comprised 7 large employers and workers' organizations for agriculture, banking, commerce, industry, internal navigation, and air and sea transport, as well as those for the arts and a number of other professions. The Council's powers were limited. Its influence was mainly through consultation, and its decisions could not affect those of the National Parliament, though its resolutions were binding for collective contracts. By February 1934, the number of corporations had expanded to 22, including those for cereal production, mining and quarrying, the chemical industry and the clothing trade. As well as containing the employers and employees' representatives, each corporation also included 3 members of the Fascist Party, who officially represented the public. The National Council's General Assembly possessed 800 members. They were mostly nominated by Mussolini, who was, up to 1929, also the Minister for Corporations, the government official responsible for them. In 1939, the Chamber of Deputies in Parliament was dissolved and replaced by a new Chamber of Fasci and Corporations. Mussolini was initially proud of the corporative state. In 1921, he declared that the enmity between labour and capital had been ended and that now both sides were working together, with complete equality of rights and duties. The Duce also claimed in a speech to the Italian Senate of 13th January 1934 that the corporate state was not an indivisible part of any single political system, but could be adopted by any industrial country which wished to maintain voluntary self-discipline through the non-coercive use of the state. Pardon me. He also claimed that fascist corporatism was an entirely new conception of the form and structure of the state, and the only form of democracy suited to the changed conditions of the 20th century. Unlike traditional democracy, the corporate state was truly democratic because it removed the traditional geographical loyalties and the divisive system of party politics, characteristic of the parliamentary system. The cooperative order was also organic, replacing these abstract loyalties with those of natural, economic, social groups. The reality, of course, was the complete opposite. Capital and labour were not treated equally, and the fascist corporate state was entirely artificial with no popular support. Rocco's leggi sindacali deprived the fascist unions of any autonomy they may have possessed, and made them instruments for the control of the workers subordinate to the party and the police. In 1928, the fascists broke up their labour federation into several different organisations in order to prevent it challenging the power of the state and the employers' organisation, the Confindustria. Contrary to Mussolini's claims and fascist propaganda, the corporations had little role in state planning. The majority of workers distrusted the fascist trade unions, which had been used to supply blackleg labour during strikes and was often under the control of the employers. When the fascist system of corporations was beginning to be constructed in the 1920s, many of the fascist union organisations were far more interested in working in the employers' organisations than the working class unions because of the greater yields they felt this would produce. The fascist unions were also weak. At the beginning of the regime, they depended very much on the support of the employers to exclude other, socialist trade unions. The employers preferred to deal with these rather than the fascists on the grounds that it was easier to overturn them, as they did not have the support of the state and the fascist party. The weakness of the fascist unions was particularly shown in September 1924 when they succeeded in winning only a 2% pay rise. As a result, the socialist Fiat, which had been driven underground, re-emerged to begin open recruitment. Most of the corporations lacked the support to be anything but company unions. In Como, they were even so weak that their members were paying contributions to the Red Leagues. The position of the employers was made even stronger by the fact that, under the Pact of Palazzo Vidoni, passed on the 2nd October 1925, trade union representation was removed from the shop floor. This gave the employers an enormous advantage, as industrial disputes could only be settled through the local trade unions and employers' organisations. Although the Confindustria eventually capitulated to fascist demands to become part of the corporative state and an organ of totalitarian government, they were far more successful than the trade unions in fighting off state control. The purge of the confederations launched by the fascist Grand Council, with the ministries of the corporations and the interior, and the fascist party, had much less effect on the Confindustria than it did on the fascist unions and the agricultural confederation. Unlike the trade unions, the Confindustria largely preserved its leadership, organisation and cadres. In fact, the Legge Sindacali greatly reinforced and extended the power of the Confindustria by making it the sole employers' organisation, empowered to deal with the state and allowing it to expand into areas from which it had been excluded by the local fascist leaders. Leadership of industry as a whole was centralised in that of the Confindustria. Beni, their representation on the fascist Grand Council, was able to obtain for them autonomy in factory management. He declared the idea of the constitutional factory to be a failure and stressed the importance of traditional factory management by saying that it conformed to fascist notions of hierarchy. And that concludes section 5, I'm sorry. Thank you for listening.